I'll just try and give you a bit of a sense of who I am, why I wrote the article, what's in the article, and we'll see if or what might be worth talking about some more. So a quick bit of my background. I worked in public housing for about 15 years in what was the old Department of Housing that I joined in 1998, and I stayed there until 2013. Since then, I've done a few different things that I won't bore you with. But the one that's probably relevant is I've recently submitted a PhD thesis, and so that's where the interest in the budget and what's going on in it came about. And I should also declare that I'm currently working for the Community Housing Industry Association in New South Wales, CHIA New South Wales, as a senior policy officer. And again, this overlaps a little bit with my interest there and the projects that I'm working on. So in my research, I was looking back sort of 30 odd years about what's been happening in the social housing space. And I think it's fair to say that the issues identified were systemic issues. So I was less focused on what's the quantity of public housing or community housing and more focused on, is the social housing system doing what it really needs to do? Is it appropriately meeting the needs of people in the community? And in doing that, I took a look at what's happened to funding over time. So as people probably know, funding was reasonable up until the 90s and then started to be squished to the point where it became non-existent. So the previous Labor government to the one that we have now basically reduced funding to something negligible and was selling public housing stock to fund the operation of the system. And that was hundreds of properties per year to raise money, perhaps thousands in some years. So that was highly problematic for obvious reasons. A number of social housing dwellings was going down while the population and the number of houses in the community was going up. The coalition government, when they came in their infinite wisdom, thought, we can do this better than Labor. We'll stop selling so much stock and we'll create a commercial sort of approach. And so they dreamt up what's more recently been called Communities Plus, but the idea of redeveloping large public housing estates, flogging off 70% of the housing on the private market to raise funds. So they figured that they would grow the portfolio by redeveloping estates. And as we all know, that didn't really work. The quantity of housing that's come from those redevelopment projects, well, it depends which projects you include, but arguably it's actually gone backwards. Although there has been some increase in social housing through ad hoc funding from time to time. So fast forward, then we have the current Labor government when they were in opposition. As you all know, they made claims about how they were going to change public and social housing. They were going to form Homes New South Wales, they were going to bring in new funding, they were going to do all sorts of things. So when the budget came around, I was surprised that there was as much money as there was for social housing. So I thought that was a good thing. But where my brain immediately went to was to say, okay, well, let's now look at what's happening to social housing as a proportion of all housing in New South Wales. That's sort of the bigger issue. And even when you factor in the federal money that's coming through the Housing Affordability Fund and those sorts of things, the Housing Australia Future Fund, got my acronyms mixed up in my head for a minute. When you add that to what was announced in the budget, you get an increase in social housing dwellings over the next 5 years of something like 12,000. But if the state government meets its housing supply targets, more broadly for all housing, the proportion of social housing is still actually going to go down over the next 5 years. Only marginally, but it actually decreases as a proportion of all housing if all the government's various targets all work. So that to me is a big concern. Happy that Labor's putting money in, but my frustration is really with the celebration that went on when the budget was announced. People sort of thought it was Christmas, this is fabulous. I'm like, hey, it is good. I'm all for it, but we've got to take a look at the bigger system. If we're not really increasing the proportion of social housing in the community, while we know that need is massively going up with increases in rents and, tight market and what have you, then we've got a problem. So one of the other things that I did was had a look at people, so this is all sort of public data from the government, had a look at people who are on Commonwealth rent assistance. So they're people who are receiving subsidy from the federal government to rent in the private sector. There's 187,000 people in New South Wales who are receiving Commonwealth rent assistance who are paying more than 30% of their income in rent, which technically puts them in housing stress. So, we've got a waiting list of whatever it is at the moment, 60,000, but it's actually more like 180,000, and that's only for people on Centrelink payments. If you're not on Centrelink payments, you're not eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. And there's a whole portion of people there who are also eligible for social housing. So there are hundreds of thousands of people who could and arguably should be in social housing and are not. And you've only got, $150,000 social housing dwellings. So you've got more than that unmet need in the community.
So how many social homes?
I don't know off the top of my head. Ballpark 150,000 in New South Wales, and need is above 200,000. So you're not going anywhere near meeting need. So my frustration was with partly the way the media releases and things were written, because it was made to sound as though there was going to be this great change in the social housing system, like Labor had come to save the day. And it's such a drop in the ocean that, my concern, my sort of hackles were raised. And so that's why I wrote this little piece of paper sort of pointing some of this out. So the issue for me, and the last paragraph in the article, if anyone ends up reading it, is really saying the approach that's being taken is a reform-oriented approach. It's accept the core system that we have and tinker with it. Reform it, make it a bit better, make it a bit more efficient. And I guess I've argued that what we need is transformation. We actually need a different take on the system. If we're serious about social housing, and I know for you particularly public housing, but if we're serious about social housing, then we'll look at all the people in need, we'll look at all the stock, we'll look at all the programs, we'll look at who's getting Commonwealth rent assistance, we'll look at everything, and we'll do a proper sort of diagnosis of what's going on in New South Wales and what we need. We can't just add 5,000 properties and pretend that we've saved the day. So really that's the gist of it from me. If people have any questions, really happy to answer them. And some of the other sort of territory that my research goes into, just in case that's relevant, is redevelopment policy. And I used Waterloo as my primary case study for my research, and looked in great depth at the policies that relate to Waterloo and how they do and don't constrain what LAC does, and the way that it redevelops and the way that it tries to generate cash to keep the system running.
All right, fantastic.